بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Inshallah, in today's class we will take issue 14, inshallah, in its entirety. And issue 14, well, I should say that there's a subsection in issue 14 which is general statements, which is the al-am, which in my translation or in the way my book is, it's kind of like a separate paragraph, and then after that is issue 15. So what I meant to say is we'll take the entirety of issue 14 up until general statements, and then we'll do general statements in the next lecture, inshallah. So issue 14 deals with prohibition. So we've been talking about commands, and as we know, sort of like the twin side or the other side of the same coin of commands is prohibitions. So the prohibitions is easy to understand if you understand some of the philosophical issues that we talked about what a command means and what it is and what it isn't. So we're going to talk about the commands, and we're going to talk about what happens if there are multiple, we're going to talk about prohibitions. What happens if there are multiple prohibitions? What happens is it a confirmed prohibition, or is it a prohibition of multiple things at the same time? And then we're going to get into a list of 8 usages of prohibition. So the prohibition form la taf'al, do not, you said if'al is to the generic act or the generic linguistic construct of the Arabic language to command, the command form. So the generic linguistic structure in the Arabic language of prohibition is la taf'al, do not act. Now la taf'al, it has different usages. It doesn't always mean that something is prohibited. And that's what's really important for us to talk about. So we'll go down that 8 list. That will probably be the bulk of the lecture. And like I did in the previous one with the commands, I'm going to give you examples. I believe they're all from the Quran. Maybe there's 1 or 2 from the Sunnah. And then following that, the last issues that we're going to discuss is we are going to talk about what happens if there's a prohibition and multiple things are listed. Does that mean everything is listed, or is there an option, or is there a confirmation? Sort of what we'll talk about in the beginning, but we'll get into the details of that. And then we're going to talk about a prohibited act and its defect, effect in the Sharia. So what happens when Allah Ta'ala says He doesn't accept an act, but the act is done? Does that mean that the act can't be done, or that the act is done without reward? So that's also what we're going to talk about. These are the main topics, and we'll begin the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so inshallah we'll begin the way we normally begin. We'll just sort of read a little bit in the Arabic and then do the translation. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. الأمران إن لم يتعاقبا أو تعاقبا بغير متماثلين فغيران. 2 commands, if they do not come after one another, or come after one another but without a command, they are different commands. So if we said, or as Allah Ta'ala says, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ. So those are 2 commands that come after one another. And in that sense, there is a command, أَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ, establish the prayers, وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ, again the command form to give the zakah. So 2 commands, if they do not come after one another, or come after one another but without a command to act, they are different commands. وَكَذَا بِمُتَمَاثِلَيْنِ. Likewise, if they come after one another without a command to act. وَلَا مَانِعَ مِنَ التَّكْرَارِ فِي الْأَصَحِّ. And there is no prevention from a repeated statement in the dominant opinion. So, if for example somebody said صلي ركعتين صلي ركعتين, pray 2 rakahs, the default would be that these are two separate commands, not that the second is a repetition of the first. Of course, the dissenting opinion, or the minor opinion, would be that the second statement, like if I said pray 2 rakahs, pray 2 rakahs, the lesser opinion would say, or the dissenting opinion would say, the second statement is a confirmation. Ta'keed is a confirmation of the first. But the default, the majority of how our usul is constructed, and you can see how that would be a slippery slope. If the minor opinion was the majority opinion, that could be very problematic. The reason the majority opinion is the majority opinion in this case is that it is safer to assume that they are two separate commands, because our job in interpreting the Quran and Sunnah is to follow the best we can what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks of us. So if we don't do that, so what's the safer option? Well, the safer option is to say that they're both commands. The less scrupulous option is to say that one is confirming the other, which means in the minority opinion you would do less. You would only pray 2 rakahs. But in the majority opinion, giving this generic example, you would pray 4 rakahs. What's better, or what's safer in your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, to pray 4 rakahs, not to pray only 2. That's why even when I say the example, I paused, because I said, well, yeah, it sounds like it's just a confirmation, you're just repeating the sentence. But we have to remember what's the point behind all of this is to interpret the Quran and Sunnah. So let me just read the Arabic again and do the English, just to give the whole thing one complete thought. الآمران إن لم يتعاقبا أو تعاقبا بغير متماثلين فغيران وكذا بمتماثلين ولا مانع من التكرار في الأصح. Two commands, if they do not come after one another, or they come after one another but without a command to act, they are different commands. Likewise, if they come after one another with a command to act, and there is no prevention from a repeated statement, in the dominant opinion. And then he says, فَإِنْ كَانَ مَانِعٌ عَادِيٌ وَعَرَضَهُ عَطْفٌ فَالْوَقْفُ وَإِلَّا فَالثَّانِي التَّأْكِيد. If there is a prevention that is natural for the command, then one must act on both. However, if there is no rational prevention, then the second clause is a confirmation. So the example he gives, which is very dramatic, he says, اقتل زيدا اقتل زيدا. Kill Zayd, kill Zayd. Well, you can only kill a person once. So obviously there is a natural prevention from the second command being a second separate command. So in that case, you have to assume that the second command is the confirmation of the first command. So he says, just to repeat, if there is a prevention that is natural for a command, like in this case, you can only do that act once, then one must act on both. However, if there is a rational prevention, then the second clause is confirmation. So in this example, kill Zayd, is a rational impossibility to do that. The first prevention, the natural prevention, salli rak'ataini, it's possible that you could do that, and it's also possible that you don't do that. So in that case, we follow the default majority position in acting on both of them and not assuming that it's a confirmation. If there's a rational impossibility, like in the second example we gave, kill Zayd, then in that case we're going to interpret the second statement as a repetition and a confirmation of the first statement. And you'll find this more in the hadith literature than you will necessarily in the Quran. Okay. I'm going to see if there's anything else before we jump to our list here. Okay. النهي now we're going to talk about prohibitions. النهي اقتضاء كف عن فعل لا بنحو كف. عفوا. النهي اقتضاء كف عن فعل لا بنحو كف. So, forbidding an act is to cease acting on something, not only with the word kuf. So kuf means to stop. So that's not the only phraseology or the only phrase or the only linguistic construct that we're going to have in the Sharia, generally and specifically in the Arabic language, that would indicate that something stops. Or else it would just be too limiting. So obviously, even in English, be careful, beware, don't do this, I warn you. I mean, all of those are indications of not doing an act. So what is the goal of the prohibition? The goal of the prohibition, as he says, is to cease acting on something. Okay, so what are the words that tell us to cease acting? The generic word in Arabic is kuf, stop. But as he says, it's not only using that word, and that's what he's going to give us now. He's going to give us this list. But before that list, he has a couple other points. وقضيته الدوام ما لم يقيد بغيره في الأصح. Its cessation of the act, that is meant to be ongoing. So when there's a default prohibition, it means stop this ongoing. Not to drink alcohol. فاجتنبوه. Stay away from alcohol all the time. Not only stay away from alcohol like in between the prayer times, but at night you can drink. So the default understanding of the prohibition is that it's ongoing. So its cessation is meant to be ongoing as long as it is not linked to another statement in the dominant opinion. وقضيته الدوام ما لم يقيد بغيره في الأصح. Like, for example, if someone said لا تسافر اليوم, do not travel today. So that second part of the statement, today, restricts the prohibition of being temporal, that the prohibition is just for today. Meaning tomorrow you could travel, or next week you could travel. But if someone said لا تسافر, لا تسافرن أبدا, or I guess in that case you said it, don't travel at all, or لا تسافرن, do not travel. Well, okay, in that case, the default understanding is that don't travel at all. So, some of this is, I think, rational. We kind of get it, but some of it, you need to think about, how language is used, so you make sure that you understand what is meant to be understood from the original statement. Now, some people will say that the prohibition is always to not travel, is to stop the act altogether all the time. That's obviously not the dominant position. In the next clip, inshallah, we'll go down our list of usages for prohibition, inshallah. Okay, now the discussion will move into the way that the prohibition structure comes in the primary sources, the siyaq, the way that it comes. So he says, وَتَرِدُ صِيغَتُهُ, and then it comes in the following forms. Number one, of course, لِلتَّحْرِيم, is to prohibit something, meaning that it is haram. And the example that he gives is in Surah Al-Isra, verse 32, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا, do not approach zina. So here, do not approach, meaning not only does it mean do not commit the act of zina, the act of adultery, but do not even begin the path towards zina. And that's why the prohibition begins with lowering the gaze, with members of the opposite sex, and then anything beyond that is equally haram, if not more haram, so on and so forth, until, may Allah Ta'ala protect us, you get to the act itself. So this is also shows you the kind of the rhetorical strength of the Quran, the balagha of the Quran, is that here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, He's not saying don't do the act, He's saying don't even come close to the act. Okay, so obviously that usage is that it's prohibited. Another way that it comes is lil-karaha, or the act is disliked. The example that he gives is verse 267 in Al-Baqarah, وَلَا تَيَمَّمُوا الْخَبِيثَ مِنْهُ تُنْفِقُونَ. When Allah Ta'ala is talking about earning your living and giving in charity, do not seek something wrong by giving your charity, because sometimes people give charity for the wrong reasons. So is it haram to give charity, if you have like a mixed niyyah? Here is saying it's disliked, because the act of charity you're rewarded for. So this is an example of how the do not act, the prohibition construct comes, but it means that the act is disliked. And this is very important, by the way, because I hope you can just sense right off the bat how a lot of misinterpretations of the Quran and Sunnah can come when people don't know the difference. Is this prohibition? Is this nahi للتحريم or للكراهة? Is it for something that is haram or something that is makruh? But then there are other categories. So the third category, he says, is للإرشاد, is for guidance. Like in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 101. لا تسألوا عن أشياء تبد لكم تسؤكم. So Allah Ta'ala says, do not ask about things such to the point that when you find out about them, they become haram and it harms you. So we have and again, this is another against the modern world paradigm, is that we have a prohibition from the point of view of guidance, that is, not to keep asking about things, just to take things simply. The Prophet ﷺ was asked about the best of religion. He said, Al-Hanafiyatu Samha, the pure, simple way of Ibrahim alayhi salam, the Hanafiya, the pure primordial religion. Of course, sometimes you have to ask. You don't want to engage in the haram, but you can't keep asking, how about this, how about that, how about an inch here, how about that, like in Surah Al-Baqarah, the story of the Baqarah. So here, Allah Ta'ala is saying, don't ask about things to the point that it becomes haram for you. So Allah Ta'ala is using the prohibition to show us guidance. Number 4 is the dua. It can come as supplication. For example, in Surah Al-Imran, verse 8, رَبَّنَا لَا تُزِغْ قُلُوبَنَا. Ya Allah, do not cause our hearts to scatter or to be misguided. So here you are using the prohibitions construct, but in the form of dua. I mean, that one's kind of easy. I think people can get that it's supplication. Number 5, بيان العاقبة, to show the final result. Here, Shaykh al-Islam gives us the example of Al-Imran, verse 169, وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتٍ بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ. Do not think that those who have died in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are dead, rather they are alive. So here, وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ, do not think. This is a prohibition, prohibiting you from thinking that those who died in the just cause fi sabilillah are dead. No, indeed they are alive. So here Allah Ta'ala is showing us the final result of something is opposite of what we may seem. And then number 6, للتقليل, to reduce. The example that he gives is Surah Taha, verse 131. وَلَا تَمُدَّنَّ عَيْنَيْكَ إِلَى مَا مَتَّعْنَا بِهِ. Do not look at the material things that we have given to other people. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reducing it. This material stuff at the end of the day is really cheap. Why would you fight over something material? It comes now, it won't come tomorrow. It comes now and then it depreciates or it breaks or it rusts or whatever. I mean, I know I have all of these things that I've collected over my life, and I'm going to get 2 of them just in case. And then the second one that's in storage or whatever it is, it just wears just by simply being in storage. And I always, subhanAllah, this life is just so cheap. These things are so cheap. So Allah is saying, don't look at, you think that the stuff that people have, that's really important. Don't look at that. So Allah Ta'ala is reducing it for us, but using, again, the prohibition construct. Number 7 is to debase, للإحتقار. Allah Ta'ala gives us, or Shaykh al-Islam gives us the example of Surah At-Tawbah, verse 66. لا تعتذروا قد كفرتم بعد إيمان لا تعتذروا قد كفرتم بعد إيمانكم. Do not give excuses. Right? Do not give excuses because you have committed kufr after your faith. So, Allah Ta'ala is debasing the excuse. Yawm al-Qiyamah, as my mashayikh used to always teach us, there's going to be a lot of crazy things on the Day of Judgment that we're going to see. People will make up stuff all the time. SubhanAllah, even on the Day of Judgment, the disbelievers will still lie to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No, we didn't disbelieve. No, we didn't disbelieve. So Allah Ta'ala will debase that statement and the construct, لا تعتذروا, do not make an excuse. So it's the command form, or of the prohibitions kind. And number 7. Number 8, the last one on the list is لليأس, to show lack of hope. For example, in Surah At-Tahrim, verse 7, لا تعتذروا اليوم similar to what and that's why in the commentary he says that some of the commentators didn't include this one because it's similar to the previous one, but it is slightly different. لا تعتذروا اليوم, do not make an excuse today. Allah Ta'ala using the command form in the prohibition style to show that there is no hope. There's no, it's too late in Yawm al-Qiyamah. Now in this life is the time for us to make amends and to make tawbah, not when it's too late. Okay, so these are 8 ways that the prohibition form has come, and 8 different meanings of the prohibition. And then he says, rahimahullah, وفي الإرادة والتحريم ما في الأمر. As for the issue of what is intended with the prohibition, what we said about the command form previously mentioned, the same applies. So, let me restate that because I misread what I even wrote. As for what is intended with the command previously mentioned, the same applies for the prohibition. And we previously mentioned this in issue 13, where we said, let me just read it really quickly. The chosen opinion is that self-speech in a command form is for something specific and not a prohibition against its opposite, nor does it necessitate it. A prohibition is just like a command. Prohibition is just like a command, so he's repeating that. So we don't have to repeat that necessarily here, but that what is meant by the prohibition is a cessation of the act itself, and it doesn't mean a command for the opposite, sort of the way that he's saying, for the reasons that we mentioned in the previous discussion. Okay. وَقَدْ يَكُونُ عَنْ وَاحِدٍ وَمُتَعَدِّدٍ جَمْعًا. Prohibition can be against one act and multiple acts together. كَالْحَرَامِ الْمُخَيَّرِ, like such as choosing which forbidden act to abstain from. وَفَرْقًا, or a separate prohibition. كَالنَّعْلَيْنِ تُلْبِسَانِ أَوْ تُنْزِعَانِ, or a separate prohibition like the hadith of the 2 sandals. وَلَا يُفَرَّقُ بَيْنَهُمَا وَجَمِيعًا كَالزِّنَا وَالسَّرِقَةِ, or altogether like in adultery and stealing. Okay, so now he's going to go into, and I'm seeing that I'm running out of time, so let me just finish this thought and then we'll pick it up in the next clip. He's talking about multiple, it's not always a simple don't do this. It's not always going to be that simple. Sometimes there are multiple things that are mentioned. Can you choose? Is there an option? Are both prohibited? Do you stay away from both or do both? Those type of iterations, those are the examples that he just gave, and I'll pick this up in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, sorry I sped through the end. Maybe I shouldn't have read that sentence, but let me just read it again. Prohibition, I'll read the English only. Prohibition can be against one act, like don't do A, that's easy. Multiple acts together, such as choosing which forbidden act to abstain from, or a separate prohibition like the hadith of the 2 sandals, or altogether like adultery and stealing. Okay, so there's a lot going on there. So let's say that, do it again piecemeal. A prohibition can be against one act. لا تقربوا الزنا. We took that before. Do not approach zina, adultery. That's a prohibition against one act. Or acts together, such as choosing which forbidden act to abstain from. So the example that he gives is لا تفعل هذا أو ذاك. Do not do this or this. So this is a prohibition against 2 things, but you can choose. Do not do A or B. So if you do A, you can do A because you're not doing B, or you can do B and you're not doing A. So what is prohibited, or what you must stay away from, the cessation is from one act. That's what he means in the Arabic, al-haram al-mukhayyar, the haram, the choosing which prohibited act to stay away from. Such as choosing which forbidden act to abstain from, or a separate prohibition, like in the hadith of the 2 sandals. This is the hadith that's in the Sahihain of Bukhari and Muslim radiallahu anhuma, in which the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يمشين أحدكم في نعل واحد لا ينعلهما جميعا لا ينعلهما جميعا أو ليخلعهما جميعا. The Prophet ﷺ forbade us from walking in one sandal. So he said either put them both on or take them both off. So don't put on one shoe or one sandal or one sock and walk around with it. Either put them both on or put them both off. That's sort of using our vernacular. So here, this is an example. A separate prohibition. So there are two prohibitions. There's one prohibited act, and then the command to do one or the other. And then he says, or altogether, like adultery and stealing. So you have to stay away from all types of adultery, obviously, and all types of stealing, as-sariqa. And then he says, وَالْأَصَحُ أَنَّ مُطْلَقَ النَّهِي وَلَوْ تَنْزِيهًا لِلْفَسَادِ شَرْعًا فِي الْمَنْهِيِ عَنْهُ إِنْ رَجَعَ النَّهْيُ إِلَيْهِ أو إلى جزئه أو لازمه أو جهل مرجعه. The dominant opinion is that a general prohibition, meaning one without a condition, is to indicate a defect in the act as defined by the Sharia. As the prohibition goes back to the act, or part of it, or a necessary part of it, or its reference is unknown. Okay. So, in a general prohibition without those conditions, we call this a defect act in the Sharia. It's fasad. So, what would make an act not defective in the Sharia is that you've gone against the prohibition. Like praying a random prayer, just a general prayer, at the times in which the prayer is prohibited. Like as the sun is rising, as the sun is setting, after Asr prayer. And we talked about this in our fiqh class. Notice how I said general prayer. So if I walk into the mosque and the sun is in the middle of setting, I can still pray the 2 rak'ahs in the Shafi'i madhab to greet the mosque, because I'm not praying a general prayer for the sake of praying. I'm praying for a concurrent reason, which is to join the mosque. So that's not what's prohibited. Here the example he's giving is just praying in a random time, praying a random prayer for the sake of praying during the time in which the prayer is prohibited. So we call this a defective act in the Sharia. Now, this is a general prohibition. So what makes the act defective is that the prohibition either goes to the act itself, like the example I just gave, the general prayer at the times in which prayer is prohibited, or part of that act, like buying and selling what's in the wombs or the seed of an animal. You can't do that. You can buy and sell, that's permissible, but what's part of it that's impermissible in that act is you're selling something that you can't see, that's not, quantified. There's no ayn, you can't see that thing, so you can't, the Sharia prohibits, it calls it a defective sale, a fasid. We said it goes back to the act, like the prayer thing, part of it, like the buying what's in the seeds, the stomach, or a necessary part of it, lazimihi, like buying and selling, I sell you 1 dirham for 2 dirhams, which is the textbook definition of riba. So you can buy and sell gold, coins, but it has to be al-mithl bil-mithl. What's necessary, lazim part of it? What's lazim is that I have bought and sold in unequal amounts in gold and silver, which is the textbook definition of riba. Or its reference is unknown. أو جهل مرجعه. Some other reason that is unknown. So those things make the act defective in the Sharia. And that's why we're talking about it here, because it's appropriate as part of the conversation of prohibitions. Prohibition. Okay. Now, not included in this if the prohibition is something exterior to the act. So the example is, I pray a prayer in land that I stole. There are two separate acts. Stealing the land is super haram. That's obviously not a technical, my term. But the prayer is valid because you made wudu and you prayed. But praying in or on top of stolen land, you see how so the prohibition is going back to not the act itself, not part of it, not necessary part of it. The prayer is all, so you'll be rewarded for the prayer, or the prayer will be valid, but it's still haram that you did so in land that you stole. Which brings up the next topic, which is an act that is fulfilled but not accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says, أما نفي القبول فقيل دليل الصحة وقيل الفساد ومثله نفي الإجزاء وقيل أولى بالفساد. As for negating the act's acceptance by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is proof that the act can occur but without reward. For example, he gives in verse 91 of Al-Imran, فَلَنْ يُقْبَلَ مِنْ أَحَدِهِمَا مِلْءَ الْأَرْضِ ذَهَبًا. Allah will not accept from the people that believe and then the disbelieve, will not accept from them even if they give a mountain's worth of gold in charity. So that shows that you can do that act, you can give a mountain's worth of gold in charity, but Allah will not give reward for that act. Which is a more spiritual concept, but you can see why it's discussed in Usul al Fiqh, because there can be an act and it can be devoid an act. And related to this are like, if the person drinks alcohol, their prayer is not accepted for 40 days. They still have to pray during those 40 days, but the act is devoid of the reward. So he says, as for negating the act's acceptance by Allah Jalla wa Ala, it is proof that the act can occur but without reward. A lesser opinion states it is proof of a defect, meaning there's a defect in that act, as we just discussed. The same goes for denying fulfillment of the act. A lesser opinion states it is to indicate a defect. So, al-ijza, if you pray the 40 prayers while may Allah Ta'ala protect us, somebody consumed alcohol, they still have to pray, but we know the hadith says if they pray for 40, their prayer is not accepted for 40 days. Does that mean that those 40 prayers are ijza? They have fulfilled their obligation, but the reward is gone? That's one opinion. And the other opinion is no. Even those, they had to pray, but they still have to pray again because those 40 days didn't count, which is obviously the lesser opinion. Okay, so we're going to stop here because I've already done, I think, too much in today's class. A little bit about the prohibition. Inshallah, in the next lecture, we'll talk about general statements. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's class, we took the bulk of, or in the way my translation and my Arabic book is, the entirety of issue 14, up until right before general statements. We talked about what happens when there are multiple commands. Is it a repetition or are they new commands? We said the default opinion and understanding is that it's a separate command, and that's safer when it comes to understanding what we need to do vis-a-vis our religious and spiritual life. And then we looked at prohibitions, and we said that the prohibition, like the command, is simply to cease acting on a specific act. And we talked about the 8 ways or the 8 forms that the prohibition comes. We gave all examples from the Quran. It could be a prohibition, meaning it's haram. It could be a disliked act, makruh. It could be something for guidance. It could be used for supplication. It can be used to show the final result. It can be used to reduce. It can be used to debase, and it can be used to show lack of hope. So it's very important that when you read prohibition, you go down the list and make sure that you understand that it can mean different things. It doesn't also always mean default that something is haram. And this is where a lot of modern Muslims get into trouble, obviously, as you can tell, because they don't have this detailed scheme of interpretation. And then we looked at that the prohibition can also be towards multiple acts, or it could be a prohibition of choosing which to prohibit, or it can be a separate prohibition, or it can be you have to stay away from the act altogether. Staying away from the act altogether, that's what we usually, the default understanding, like the basic understanding of the prohibition, but we gave some examples of different ways. And then we looked at the defect, when an act is defective, fasid, how when there's a general prohibition, the act becomes defective, either because it goes back to the act itself, a part of the act, a necessary act, or the reference is unknown. And then lastly, we looked at an act not being done but not accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from a reward point of view. And then we looked at some of the necessary parts of that discussion. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.